The moments after Mr. Thomas placed his order were filled with the usual hum of activity. Waiters moved swiftly, serving tables, filling glasses with wine, and offering the polished service that made this restaurant the popular choice for people looking to indulge. The lighting was warm, the chandeliers casting soft shadows across the room, the sound of quiet conversations echoing against the walls. For most, it was just another ordinary day at the restaurant. But for Mr. Thomas, it was anything but ordinary. Though his demeanor remained calm, Mr. Thomas couldn't ignore the sting of Ben's words. He had spent a lifetime learning to rise above the prejudices of others, but even after all these years, it still hurt. The younger generation sometimes didn't know how much weight their words could carry, or how deeply they could wound a person. But Mr. Thomas wasn't angry. He had learned long ago that anger, when directed outward, served no real purpose. Instead, it only fed the fire of hatred. What Mr. Thomas understood, and what many people didn't, was that compassion was the antidote. Understanding was the bridge, and patience, the kind of patience he had developed over a lifetime, was what could change a person's heart. Still, Mr. Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that there was something he needed to do here. He wasn't sure what it was yet, but he felt certain that this wasn't just about him. It was about the bigger picture, about the kind of restaurant he had built, a space where people from all walks of life could come together, enjoy a meal, and experience a level of service and respect that should be universal. As the minutes ticked by, Ben went about his duties with his usual sharp efficiency, though his attitude toward Mr. Thomas grew more evident with each passing moment. His face remained plastered with a thin, condescending smile every time he returned to the table. He treated Mr. Thomas like an invisible presence, like a ghost who didn't belong, someone to be tolerated rather than respected. Ben walked by the table again. This time he was delivering a dessert to a couple sitting nearby. His gaze briefly flickered toward Mr. Thomas, who was quietly sipping his wine, lost in his own thoughts. Ben's eyes narrowed. It was clear that he had underestimated the old man. "Excuse me, sir," Ben said, his voice dripping with false politeness. "Do you need anything else?" He made sure to look Mr. Thomas up and down once more. He wasn't subtle about it. Mr. Thomas looked up from his plate, meeting Ben's eyes. There was no anger in his gaze, only calm. "No, thank you," he replied. "I'm quite content." Ben made a show of taking his order pad out of his pocket, then glanced at Mr. Thomas again. "Of course, enjoy the rest of your meal, sir." But as Ben turned to walk away, he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for Mr. Thomas to hear, "People like you coming in here like they own the place. You're lucky we even serve you." For a brief moment the world seemed to pause. Mr. Thomas's grip on his wine glass tightened. He felt a rush of emotions flood him, disappointment, frustration, and a sharp, bitter recognition of just how ingrained these attitudes still were. And yet, he said nothing. He couldn't waste his energy on Ben's small-mindedness. But that didn't mean he would allow this incident to pass by unnoticed. Minutes later, Ben was at the counter, chatting with his co-workers, laughing in a way that only someone who had never experienced real struggle could. He continued to joke and ridicule Mr. Thomas in hushed tones, still oblivious to who he truly was. Meanwhile, Mr. Thomas remained quiet, finishing his meal. He had long learned that sometimes silence was more powerful than words. He had to admit that the young man's ignorance wasn't entirely his fault. It was a reflection of the broader societal attitudes that had shaped him, attitudes that could only be challenged by examples of courage, strength, and compassion. Mr. Thomas's moment of reflection was interrupted by the sound of the door opening at the back of the restaurant. The owner had arrived. He walked into the dining room, his presence commanding attention. The noise of conversation faded as people glanced up, recognizing the figure who held the keys to this establishment's success. But what the staff didn't know, what none of the customers knew, was that Mr. Thomas was not just another customer. He was not just another elderly man having a meal. He was, in fact, the owner of the very restaurant they worked in. The owner walked toward the back office, but stopped when he saw Mr. Thomas sitting at the table. The old man had remained composed throughout the ordeal, but the owner could see something was different. There was an aura around him, a quiet, dignified strength. The owner called Ben over. His tone was calm but firm. "Ben, could you come here for a moment?" Ben was taken aback. He had been in the middle of a conversation, and now his manager wanted to speak with him. He thought nothing of it. As far as he was concerned, he had done nothing wrong. He approached the owner, still smug. "What's up, boss?" Ben asked. "I just wanted to talk to you for a moment about customer service," the owner said. "Specifically about your interaction with that customer sitting by the window." Ben furrowed his brow. "That guy?" he asked, motioning toward Mr. Thomas. "What about him?" The owner's expression hardened. "That customer, Ben, is Mr. Thomas, the owner of this restaurant. He has built this business from the ground up. The place you work in, the food you serve, the life you get to enjoy here, it's all because of him." Ben's face went pale. The words hit him like a thunderclap. He stood there, stunned, struggling to comprehend what he had just heard. The old man, the man he had mocked, the man he had assumed was just another elderly black person with no business being in such a fine establishment. "Yes, Ben," the owner said, his voice cold. "And what you did, what you said, is unacceptable." Ben stammered, his mind racing. He had no idea how to apologize for what had just happened. How could he even begin to make amends for the disrespect he had shown? The owner stood tall, watching Ben struggle. He wasn't angry, but he was disappointed. Disappointed not just in Ben, but in the larger culture that allowed such disrespect to persist. "You'll be hearing from HR," the owner said quietly. "You're going to have to leave for the day. But before you go, I want you to think about something." Ben looked up, his face filled with a mix of fear and regret. "The thing is, Ben," the owner continued, "you didn't just disrespect Mr. Thomas. You disrespected everyone in this restaurant, everyone who works here and everyone who comes through that door. You assumed that because of someone's age or their skin color, they don't deserve the same level of respect as anyone else. But the truth is, none of us are immune from making mistakes. I've made my own share, and I expect everyone here to learn from them." Ben stood there, silent. The gravity of the situation was finally sinking in. He had just lost his job over something that could have easily been avoided, something he could have fixed in an instant, had he chosen kindness over arrogance. As Ben was escorted out of the restaurant, Mr. Thomas continued to sit in the same spot, quietly finishing his meal. The rest of the staff gathered, now aware of the truth. Mr. Thomas didn't leave right away. He had no intention of being the center of attention. But he knew the importance of this moment, not just for him, but for the future of the restaurant, and for the people who worked there. The restaurant remained a space where people of all kinds could come together, where everyone was treated with dignity and respect, no matter their background. Mr. Thomas had worked hard to build that, and now the staff would learn, perhaps the hard way, how precious such values truly were. In the days that followed, Ben's actions became a lesson that rippled throughout the entire restaurant. Staff members began to change, their attitudes shifting. They realized that it wasn't enough to just serve food and drinks. They needed to serve people with respect. And as the weeks passed, The atmosphere in the restaurant became one of kindness and understanding, all thanks to the lessons learned from one deeply impactful moment. Mr. Thomas went on to continue his work, not just as an owner, but as a silent teacher, teaching those around him the most important values of all: kindness, respect, and humility. And as for Ben, he would never forget the lesson he had learned that day. It had come at the cost of his job, but it would stay with him for the rest of his life. Never judge someone based on their appearance, their age, or their race. Always treat others with respect, for you never know when the tables might turn. Ben's departure marked a turning point not just for him, but for the entire team at the restaurant. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the establishment began to change. It wasn't an instant transformation, but the ripple effect was undeniable. Staff members who had once been indifferent or dismissive towards certain customers started to treat everyone with a newfound respect. They realized that their job wasn't just about serving food and drinks. It was about making people feel valued, regardless of who they were. The lessons of that day spread through the staff like wildfire. Conversations that were once filled with idle chatter and jokes took on a more serious tone. They began discussing the importance of treating people equally, regardless of their race, age, or background. The management team held meetings, emphasizing how one negative interaction could ruin the reputation of the restaurant, and that the way they treated customers reflected on the values they upheld as a business. Mr. Thomas watched all of this from a distance, his calm demeanor never faltering. He didn't feel the need to point out that the staff had learned a lesson. They were learning it on their own. He had always believed in the power of quiet influence, and this was a prime example of it. He hadn't needed to raise his voice or make a scene. The truth had come out, and it had changed everything. Meanwhile, Ben's life outside the restaurant was no less impacted by his actions. After being let go, he found himself with a lot of free time to reflect. His friends and family were supportive, but many of them had been shocked by his behavior. They had never known him to act so arrogantly, so dismissively toward others. He had always been a friendly, albeit slightly opinionated person, but what had happened that day had made him question who he really was and what he stood for. At first, Ben struggled to find work. Word had gotten around about his behavior at the restaurant, and some potential employers were hesitant to hire him. But in the silence of his time off, he began to reflect on what had led him to that moment. He realized how much of his life had been shaped by stereotypes and biases that he had never questioned. He thought about how easily he had dismissed Mr. Thomas simply because of his age and the color of his skin. He had been so sure of his own superiority that he hadn't even considered the possibility that he might be wrong. But as the days passed, Ben made a decision. He was going to change. He knew it wouldn't be easy, and he knew it would take time, but he was willing to put in the effort. He wanted to be someone who respected all people, regardless of their background. He wanted to learn about the struggles of others, to better understand the experiences of those he had once dismissed. It wasn't enough to apologize to Mr. Thomas. It was about changing the way he saw the world, and the way he treated the people in it. Ben enrolled in community programs that focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. He sought out opportunities to volunteer and immerse himself in communities he had previously been too quick to judge. Slowly but surely, he started to build relationships with people from all walks of life. And through those relationships, he learned more about the struggles others faced. He heard stories of injustice, of prejudice, and of perseverance. And through those stories, Ben began to understand the weight of the words he had spoken to Mr. Thomas. Back at the restaurant, life went on. Mr. Thomas continued his work with the same humility and grace that had earned him the respect of so many people. He wasn't one to seek recognition or applause, and he certainly wasn't in the business of teaching lessons to people who weren't ready to learn them. But he was content in knowing that in some small way he had made a difference. One afternoon, several months after the incident, the owner of the restaurant walked up to Mr. Thomas with an update. "You know, Ben came by today," the owner said, his voice filled with a mix of curiosity and caution. "He wanted to apologize. He said he's been working on himself, doing a lot of self-reflection. He wanted me to tell you that he's really sorry for how he treated you." Mr. Thomas listened quietly. He didn't need to hear the apology. He had already forgiven Ben the moment the young man had walked away that day. Forgiveness wasn't something he held on to. It was something he gave, freely and without expectation. "I'm glad to hear that," Mr. Thomas replied, his voice gentle. "But it's not about me. It's about him. He's the one who has to change." The owner nodded. "I agree. He said he's learning a lot about himself, and I believe him. He's not the same person he was that day." Mr. Thomas smiled softly. "That's all we can ask for. People will make mistakes, but it's how they respond that defines them." And so, life continued at the restaurant. Mr. Thomas remained a quiet, influential figure in the background, watching as the staff began to truly embrace the values of respect and kindness. It wasn't always perfect, and not every employee was able to fully change their mindset, but the impact of that day, the day Ben had disrespected Mr. Thomas, was felt throughout the business. The restaurant became a place where everyone, regardless of who they were, felt welcome. The story of that moment lived on, not just in the lessons Ben had learned, but in the way the restaurant had transformed. It became more than just a place to eat. It became a symbol of what it meant to treat people with dignity, to see beyond the surface, and to embrace diversity with open arms. Ben eventually returned to work at a different restaurant, and though he wasn't in the same line of work as he once was, he kept the lessons he had learned close to his heart. His journey wasn't over, and he knew he still had much to learn, but he was no longer the same person who had mocked an elderly man. He had found a new path, one built on understanding, empathy, and respect. Mr. Thomas, on the other hand, continued to build his restaurant empire quietly and with purpose. He never sought out recognition, but those who knew him understood the kind of man he was. He didn't need to be loud or assertive. His actions spoke louder than words ever could. Through his work, he had taught countless people, not just about business, but about life itself. As the years went on, the lessons from that day lived on. The restaurant remained a beacon of what it meant to treat others with kindness and dignity, and every now and then a customer would sit at the table by the window, the same table where Mr. Thomas had dined that day, and think about the stories they had heard. Stories about how the place had come to be, and how it stood as a testament to the power of respect, compassion, and change. And in the quiet moments when the lights were dimmed and the restaurant was closing, Mr. Thomas would sit back, content in the knowledge that, even in the smallest of ways, he had made a difference. And that was enough. As Mr. Thomas grew older, his influence in the community expanded. He became known not only for his restaurant empire, but also for his work in mentoring younger entrepreneurs. His story was often told in business circles, not just as a success story, but as a tale of wisdom, humility, and the importance of treating everyone with equal respect. The lessons he imparted about treating people with kindness and dignity resonated with many, and he was invited to speak at events and seminars about leadership, business ethics, and diversity. But for Mr. Thomas, the most rewarding aspect of his life wasn't the accolades or the business achievements. It was the quiet moments when he saw the impact of his principles on the people around him. When he walked through his restaurants and saw employees working together harmoniously, when he heard customers chatting and laughing with staff as if they were family, he knew that his legacy was alive and well. One day, while visiting one of his restaurants, he noticed a young man sitting at the bar, alone, looking thoughtful. The man seemed out of place, dressed in a sharp suit, but his posture was slumped, and his eyes were distant as if lost in thought. Mr. Thomas had seen many people like him, ambitious, driven, but carrying a heavy weight of pride and arrogance. He approached the young man, offering a warm smile. "Is this seat taken?" Mr. Thomas asked gently. The young man looked up surprised, but quickly recovered. "No, go ahead," he replied, standing to offer the seat. Mr. Thomas sat down, feeling a sense of déjà vu. There was something about this young man that reminded him of Ben. The cocky attitude, the sense of superiority that seemed to hide a deeper insecurity. The young man introduced himself as Marcus, a recent college graduate who had just started his career in finance. "You seem a bit distant," Mr. Thomas observed with a smile. "I don't mean to pry, but something seems to be weighing on you." Marcus hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "I've just been feeling like I'm not getting the respect I deserve. I'm putting in the work, but it's like people just don't see me." Mr. Thomas nodded, understanding more than Marcus realized. "You know, when I first started out, I thought that if I just worked hard enough, people would recognize me too. But the truth is, respect isn't something you can demand. It's something you earn, not through power or status, but through kindness and humility." Marcus looked at Mr. Thomas, intrigued. "What do you mean?" "Being respected isn't about having the title or the position," Mr. Thomas continued. "It's about how you treat the people around you, the people who serve you, the people who work for you, the people you meet along the way. If you want respect, you need to show respect first. It's easy to dismiss people based on their appearance or their position, but it's when you treat everyone with kindness that you build the respect you deserve." Marcus thought about this for a moment. "I never really thought about it like that." Mr. Thomas smiled. "Most people don't, especially when they're starting out. But trust me, it will make a difference in your life. It's not about the title, the money, or the accolades. It's about the relationships you build and the way you make others feel." As Marcus listened, something began to shift inside him. The arrogant facade he had built around himself started to crack. He realized that, despite all his success, he had been neglecting the people around him. He had been so focused on climbing the ladder that he had forgotten to treat others with the respect they deserved. "I think I've been going about things all wrong," Marcus admitted. "I've been so focused on proving myself that I haven't paid attention to the people who've helped me along the way." Mr. Thomas smiled again, a knowing look in his eyes. "It's never too late to change, Marcus. You don't need to have all the answers. But if you keep an open heart and a respectful attitude, you'll find that people will respect you in return." For the rest of the afternoon, the two men talked about life, business, and the importance of humility. Marcus shared his aspirations and the challenges he faced in his career, while Mr. Thomas offered advice and wisdom drawn from years of experience. By the end of their conversation, Marcus felt lighter, more hopeful about the future, and determined to change his approach to life. A few weeks later, Marcus returned to the restaurant. This time he was different. He greeted the staff with a smile and took the time to ask how they were doing. He made an effort to remember their names, and even struck up conversations with the regular customers, listening to their stories with genuine interest. It wasn't a dramatic change, but it was noticeable. The staff, in turn, began to respond positively. They respected Marcus for the first time, not because of his position or wealth, but because of the way he treated them. Slowly he started to build real connections, and the respect he had been seeking came to him naturally. He realized that the key to success wasn't about proving his worth. It was about lifting others up along the way. Meanwhile, the restaurant continued to thrive. Mr. Thomas's vision had not only shaped the way the business operated, but it had also created a culture of respect that extended far beyond the walls of the restaurant. As more people learned about his story, the restaurant became a symbol of inclusivity and kindness, a place where everyone, no matter who they were, felt welcome and valued. One evening, as Mr. Thomas sat in the restaurant enjoying a quiet meal, he overheard a conversation between two young waitstaff. They were discussing the impact of his philosophy on their work and their lives. "I can't believe how much this place has changed," one of them said. "I remember when I first started working here, I was so nervous. But now it feels like we're all part of something bigger, something important. It's not just about the food or the tips. It's about the people and the way we make them feel." The other waiter nodded. "Yeah, I've noticed it too. It's like Mr. Thomas really gets it. He doesn't treat us like employees. He treats us like family." Mr. Thomas smiled to himself, pleased that the values he had worked so hard to instill in the restaurant had become a part of its very foundation. His work was never about recognition, but it was moments like these that reminded him of the lasting impact of kindness, respect, and humility. As the years passed, his legacy continued to grow. The restaurant became a place where people not only came to enjoy great food, but to experience what it meant to treat others with dignity and compassion. And as the world changed, so did the lessons Mr. Thomas had imparted. They lived on, not just in the walls of the restaurant, but in the hearts and minds of everyone who had been touched by his story. And so, the journey of Mr. Thomas, the quiet man who had once been disrespected by a young waiter, continued to inspire. His message was simple yet profound. Respect was not given by title or position, but earned through kindness, humility, and understanding. The end was not an ending at all. It was just another chapter in a story that would go on, spreading its influence to the generations that would follow. The restaurant remained a vibrant hub for the community, a place where people came not only to eat, but to experience a rare sense of connection and understanding. Over time, stories about Mr. Thomas's humility and his ability to inspire respect through quiet actions became a source of pride for the staff and regular customers. One day Marcus returned to the restaurant, but this time not as a customer. Dressed casually and carrying a folder of documents, he walked in with a confident yet humble demeanor. He approached Mr. Thomas, who was seated at his favorite corner table, quietly observing the bustling activity of the restaurant. "Mr. Thomas," Marcus began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "I've been thinking about everything you told me that day. It changed my life. I wanted to show you something." Mr. Thomas set down his cup of tea and gestured for Marcus to take a seat. Marcus opened the folder, revealing a detailed proposal for a non-profit organization. "I've started this initiative to mentor young professionals, especially those from underprivileged backgrounds. I realized how much I've gained by learning from you and others like you, and I want to pass that on. I want to create opportunities for people who might not get a fair chance otherwise." Mr. Thomas looked at the proposal, a warm smile spreading across his face. "This is a wonderful idea, Marcus. It shows how much you've grown. I'm proud of you." Marcus chuckled nervously. "I couldn't have done it without your advice. You made me see things differently, and I wanted to ask if you'd consider being part of it, maybe as an advisor." The older man leaned back, taking a moment to consider the offer. He didn't seek positions of authority or titles, but the sincerity in Marcus's request moved him. I'd be honored to help, Marcus. If my experiences can inspire others, then it's worth every effort. With Mr. Thomas's support, Marcus launched the organization, which quickly gained traction. The mentorship program bridged gaps between people of diverse backgrounds, promoting respect, understanding, and collaboration. Stories of transformation poured in. Young people who had been overlooked were now thriving, thanks to the guidance and opportunities they received. Back at the restaurant, life continued as it always had. The staff upheld the values Mr. Thomas had instilled, ensuring that everyone who walked through the doors felt valued and respected. The lessons learned from Mr. Thomas's quiet strength rippled outward, reaching far beyond the restaurant's walls. One evening, as Mr. Thomas closed up the restaurant, a customer approached him. She was an elderly woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "Mr. Thomas," she said softly, "I just wanted to thank you. My grandson was part of Marcus's program. He always felt overlooked because of where we came from, but now he's flourishing. He talks about the values he's learned: kindness, respect, humility. And I know those values started with you." The words touched Mr. Thomas deeply. He nodded, his voice steady but heartfelt. "Thank you for sharing that. It means more than I can say." The woman smiled and placed a hand over his. "You've changed so many lives, Mr. Thomas. Never forget that." As the years went by, Mr. Thomas continued to quietly inspire those around him. His story became a reminder that respect is a universal language, one that transcends age, race, or status. The restaurant he built was more than a business. It was a symbol of the power of kindness and the strength of humility. And though Mr. Thomas preferred to stay out of the spotlight, his influence continued to grow, one act of respect at a time, creating a legacy that would endure for generations. As time passed, the legacy of Mr. Thomas extended far beyond anything he could have imagined. His restaurants became landmarks, not just for their delicious food, but for the atmosphere of unity and dignity they cultivated. People traveled from miles away to experience the place where everyone was treated as an equal, where every interaction carried the weight of mutual respect. Marcus's non-profit organization also thrived, with branches springing up in cities across the country. Each one carried the same ethos: mentoring individuals to achieve their potential while teaching the values of humility, empathy, and inclusivity. Marcus often spoke of Mr. Thomas during interviews and public appearances, crediting him as the person who had opened his eyes and changed his path. In one particularly memorable speech at a leadership summit, Marcus shared the story of his transformation. He spoke of the day he first met Mr. Thomas, describing the quiet wisdom that had shattered his arrogance and reshaped his perspective. "I walked into his restaurant as someone who thought respect was owed to me because of my education, my job, or the suit I wore," Marcus said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But Mr. Thomas taught me that real respect is something you earn, not by demanding it, but by showing it to others first." His lessons didn't just change the way I approach my career, they changed the way I live my life. The audience gave Marcus a standing ovation, but it was Mr. Thomas, sitting quietly in the back of the room, who felt the deepest sense of pride. He hadn't sought recognition or applause, but seeing the ripple effects of his principles in Marcus's work was the greatest reward he could imagine. Back at the restaurant, Mr. Thomas continued to live his life as he always had, greeting customers with a smile, mentoring his staff, and fostering an environment where everyone felt valued. Over time, new generations of employees joined the team, bringing fresh energy and ideas while upholding the traditions that made the place special. One day, a young waiter approached Mr. Thomas nervously. "Mr. Thomas," the waiter began, shifting on his feet, "I just wanted to thank you. This is my first job and I wasn't sure what to expect, but working here has been amazing. You've taught me so much, not just about the job, but about how to treat people. I feel like I'm part of something really special." Mr. Thomas smiled warmly, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "That means a lot to me. Always remember, it's not just about the work you do, it's about the way you make others feel. If you carry that lesson with you, you'll go far." The waiter nodded, his confidence growing. "I won't forget it, sir. Thank you." As the waiter walked away, Mr. Thomas reflected on how the cycle of respect and kindness continued to grow. Each person who learned those values carried them forward, spreading them to others in their lives. It was a quiet but profound revolution, one rooted in the simplest yet most powerful human principles. One evening, long after the restaurant had closed for the night, Mr. Thomas sat alone at his favorite table, sipping tea and gazing out at the empty dining room. The space felt alive, filled with the echoes of laughter, conversation, and the countless connections that had been made there. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, the challenges, the triumphs, the moments of doubt, and the people who had helped shape his path. He remembered the young waiter who had once disrespected him, and how that moment had sparked a chain of events that transformed not just his life, but so many others. A soft smile crossed his face. He knew that his work wasn't about the food, the business, or even the recognition. It was about the lives he had touched and the lessons he had passed on. And as he sat there surrounded by the legacy he had built, he felt a profound sense of peace. Mr. Thomas's journey was far from over, but he knew that whatever the future held, the values he had lived by would endure. They were woven into the fabric of his restaurants, his relationships, and the countless lives he had inspired. And so, the story of Mr. Thomas continued, not as a single narrative, but as a tapestry of kindness, respect, and quiet strength that would resonate for generations to come. As the years went on, Mr. Thomas became a quiet legend in the community. While he avoided the limelight, his name became synonymous with humility, wisdom, and integrity. People of all walks of life sought his advice, not just about business, but about life. Despite his success, Mr. Thomas remained grounded. He continued to spend his days at the restaurant, greeting customers, chatting with staff, and ensuring everything ran smoothly. It wasn't uncommon to see him wiping down tables or helping in the kitchen, much to the amazement of patrons who knew of his stature. One day, a man walked into the restaurant, older now, with gray streaks in his hair and a weathered look on his face. Mr. Thomas noticed him immediately. It was Ben, the waiter from all those years ago, the one who had disrespected him so boldly. Ben hesitated at the door, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Mr. Thomas. Gathering his courage, he approached. "Mr. Thomas," Ben said, his voice trembling slightly, "I wasn't sure if you'd remember me." Mr. Thomas stood and offered his hand, his expression kind but measured. "Of course I remember you, Ben. It's been a long time." Ben shook his hand, a flicker of relief crossing his face. "I've thought about that day so many times. I was young and foolish, and I let my arrogance blind me. I wanted to apologize, even though I know it's far too late." Mr. Thomas gestured for Ben to sit, his demeanor warm and inviting. "It's never too late to apologize, Ben. But tell me, what brings you here today?" Ben hesitated, then admitted, Life hasn't been easy for me. I lost my job a while back, and I've been trying to find my way ever since. I thought maybe I could start over somehow." Mr. Thomas listened carefully, his gaze steady. He could see the sincerity in Ben's eyes, the weight of regret and the desire for redemption. "You know, Ben," Mr. Thomas began, "life has a way of teaching us lessons, sometimes the hard way. But what matters most is what we do with those lessons. If you're ready to start over, I believe you can. But it has to begin with humility and respect for yourself and for others." Ben nodded, tears brimming in his eyes. "I understand that now. I just hope I can prove it, not just to you, but to myself." Mr. Thomas smiled, his voice gentle but firm. "Every day is a chance to prove it, Ben, and if you're willing to put in the work, I believe you'll find your way." From that day forward, Ben became a regular at the restaurant, not as an employee but as a volunteer, eager to contribute in any way he could. He spent his days cleaning tables, greeting customers, and quietly observing the lessons that radiated from Mr. Thomas's leadership. Over time, he rebuilt his confidence and found a new sense of purpose. The community began to take notice of Ben's transformation, and his story became yet another testament to the power of kindness and second chances. Mr. Thomas never once brought up the incident from years ago, choosing instead to focus on the progress Ben was making. As the restaurant flourished, so did its reputation as a place of inclusion and hope. It became more than just a business. It was a beacon for the values Mr. Thomas held dear. And as the years turned into decades, the restaurant's story became intertwined with the lives of everyone it touched. In his later years, Mr. Thomas decided to step back from the daily operations of the restaurant, passing the torch to the next generation of leaders he had mentored. But even in retirement, he remained a guiding presence, offering advice and encouragement whenever it was needed. One evening, the staff organized a celebration in his honor, inviting customers, employees, and community members to share their stories about how Mr. Thomas had impacted their lives. The restaurant was filled with laughter, tears, and heartfelt tributes, a testament to the legacy he had built. When it was Mr. Thomas's turn to speak, he stood before the crowd, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've always believed that the true measure of success isn't found in wealth or titles," he said. "It's found in the way we treat others, the lives we touch, and the respect we earn through our actions. This restaurant was never just about food. It was about creating a place where everyone felt valued, where kindness was the currency we traded in." The crowd erupted into applause, but Mr. Thomas raised a hand, his smile humble. "This isn't my legacy," he continued. "It's ours. Each of you has played a role in making this place what it is, and as long as we carry these values forward, the work we've done here will never be forgotten." As the celebration continued late into the night, Mr. Thomas watched with a heart full of gratitude. The journey that had begun with a single moment of disrespect had grown into something far greater, a story of redemption, unity, and the enduring power of respect. And so the legacy of Mr. Thomas lived on, a shining example of how one person's unwavering commitment to kindness could change the world, one interaction at a time. As the years stretched into decades, Mr. Thomas's legacy only deepened. The restaurant stood as a symbol of transformation, kindness, and hope. Its walls bore the echoes of countless stories of laughter, reconciliation, and lessons learned. People came from all over not just to eat, but to experience something greater, something intangible yet profound. Mr. Thomas's quiet wisdom had touched lives across generations. Children who had once run through the restaurant's halls now brought their own children, sharing stories of how a simple act of kindness from an unassuming man had shifted the course of their lives. The restaurant became more than just a place to dine. It became a living, breathing memory of everything Mr. Thomas had stood for. Marcus, now a prominent figure in his own right, ensured that the values Mr. Thomas had instilled were woven into the very fabric of the mentorship programs he expanded. He often returned to the restaurant, not as a leader but as a student, someone still learning from the man who had once taught him to see the world differently. One evening Marcus brought his son to meet Mr. Thomas. The boy, barely 9 years old, gazed in awe at the elderly man sitting in the corner booth, sipping his tea. "Mr. Thomas," Marcus said, his voice brimming with respect, "this is my son, Elijah. I've told him about you and the lessons you taught me. I wanted him to meet the man who changed everything for our family." Elijah stepped forward shyly, offering a small handshake. Mr. Thomas's eyes twinkled as he shook the boy's hand. "Your father has done great things, Elijah," Mr. Thomas said warmly, "and I'm sure you'll do even greater things. Just remember, no matter where life takes you, always lead with kindness and respect." The boy nodded, his face lighting up with a smile. Marcus, watching the exchange, felt a deep sense of gratitude. The lessons that had shaped him were now being passed to his son, creating a ripple effect that would continue for generations. As the years went by, Mr. Thomas grew older, but his spirit remained as vibrant as ever. One day, as he sat in the restaurant surrounded by familiar faces, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He thought of Ben, Marcus, the young waiter who had once spoken to him with such respect, and the countless others who had walked through those doors, leaving forever changed. The restaurant thrived under new leadership, but its soul remained rooted in Mr. Thomas's principles. He spent his final years watching it flourish, knowing that the seeds he had planted would continue to grow long after he was gone. When Mr. Thomas passed away peacefully in his sleep, the community mourned the loss of a man who had been so much more than a restaurateur. They gathered to celebrate his life, sharing stories of how he had touched their hearts and changed their lives. The restaurant remained open that day, offering free meals to everyone who came, a gesture Mr. Thomas himself would have insisted on. On the wall of the restaurant, a plaque was installed in his memory. It read, "In loving memory of Mr. Thomas, a man who showed us that respect and kindness can transform the world. May his legacy inspire us to treat one another with the dignity and love we all deserve." The restaurant continued to thrive, its walls filled with the laughter and warmth of new generations. And though Mr. Thomas was no longer there in person, his presence could still be felt in every corner of the space he had created. His legacy lived on in the lives he had touched, a powerful reminder of the enduring impact of kindness and respect. And so the story of Mr. Thomas became not just a memory but a movement, a testament to the idea that one person with unwavering principles and a kind heart can create a ripple of change that lasts forever. The legacy of Mr. Thomas extended beyond the walls of his restaurant. It began to weave its way into the very fabric of the community, becoming a symbol of what could be achieved when kindness and respect were prioritized above all else. While the restaurant continued to thrive as a cornerstone of the neighborhood, its impact was far greater than anyone could have imagined. The plaque on the restaurant's wall became a source of inspiration for every customer who entered. Families often stopped to read it, explaining its significance to their children. School groups visited on field trips to learn about the history of the establishment and the values it upheld. Teachers shared stories about Mr. Thomas during lessons on character and ethics, emphasizing the importance of treating everyone with dignity. One day, a young woman named Alicia walked into the restaurant. She was a journalist working on a feature about influential community leaders. The moment she entered, she felt the warmth and energy that radiated from the place. She sat down with a notepad, observing the interactions around her, smiling servers, laughing customers, and the seamless flow of the staff working together. Alicia eventually spoke to the current manager, a middle-aged woman named Clara, who had been one of Mr. Thomas's protégés. Clara shared her own story, explaining how she had started as a dishwasher in her teens, uncertain of her future. Mr. Thomas saw potential in everyone, Clara said, her eyes glistening with emotion. He didn't care about where you came from or what you'd been through. He cared about where you were going. He gave me confidence when I didn't have any and taught me how to lead with compassion. Everything I am today is because of him. The article Alicia wrote became a viral sensation, capturing hearts across the country. Titled, "The Man Who Built a Legacy of Respect," it painted a vivid picture of Mr. Thomas's life and the impact of his values. People from all walks of life were moved by the story, many of them reaching out to the restaurant to share how it had inspired them. Marcus, still deeply connected to Mr. Thomas's legacy, had taken his mentorship programs to a national level. He established the Thomas Foundation for Leadership and Respect, an organization that focused on providing opportunities for underserved communities while instilling the values of kindness, humility, and hard work. The foundation launched initiatives such as scholarships for young leaders, leadership retreats, and community service programs. Marcus often quoted Mr. Thomas during his speeches, reminding audiences that success was not about what you gained, but about what you gave back. One of Marcus's favorite projects involved creating mentorship pairings where established professionals guided young people from disadvantaged backgrounds. The program became a resounding success, with participants frequently citing Mr. Thomas's story as their inspiration. Mr. Thomas taught us that the smallest act of kindness can spark a chain reaction, Marcus said during a keynote address at a national conference. It's a simple idea, but it's the most powerful one I've ever learned. Ben, the former waiter who had once disrespected Mr. Thomas, became one of the restaurant's most vocal advocates. Over the years, he found new purpose, dedicating himself to spreading the values he had learned through his own painful experience. He began speaking at schools, sharing his story with students who were struggling to find their way. "I was arrogant and blind," Ben often admitted, "but one man's kindness showed me the truth, that we all have the power to change if we're willing to face our mistakes and grow from them." Ben's talks became popular, with schools requesting his presence to inspire their students. He often ended his speeches by inviting the audience to visit Mr. Thomas's restaurant, not just for the food, but for the experience of being in a place where respect was the foundation of everything. Years later, Elijah, Marcus's son, took his own place in the ongoing story of Mr. Thomas's legacy. Inspired by the lessons he had learned as a child, Elijah pursued a career in community leadership, dedicating himself to building programs that promoted equity and opportunity. One of Elijah's proudest moments came when he unveiled a new project, the Thomas Center for Respect and Unity. Built in the heart of the community, the center served as a hub for education, mentorship, and cultural events. We wanted to create a space where people could come together, regardless of their backgrounds, to learn, grow, and connect, Elijah said during the center's opening ceremony. This isn't just about honoring Mr. Thomas's legacy, it's about carrying it forward. The center quickly became a beacon for the community, hosting workshops, art exhibitions, and leadership training sessions. Its walls were adorned with photos and quotes from Mr. Thomas, serving as a constant reminder of the values that had built it. The restaurant itself expanded, with new locations opening in cities across the country. Each one maintained the same core values, with training programs ensuring that every employee understood the importance of respect and kindness. Customers often remarked that stepping into any of the restaurants felt like coming home. The atmosphere was warm and welcoming, a testament to the culture Mr. Thomas had created. In addition to its physical growth, the restaurant launched a series of online cooking classes, sharing the secrets behind its beloved dishes while emphasizing the importance of community and connection. These classes became wildly popular, with participants from around the world tuning in to learn not just about food, but about the philosophy behind it. Decades after Mr. Thomas's passing, the community organized a grand celebration to mark what would have been his 100th birthday. The event brought together people from all over, former employees, customers, community leaders, and even those who had only heard of Mr. Thomas through his story. The celebration included speeches, performances, and a special unveiling of a statue honoring Mr. Thomas. The statue depicted him standing proudly, a welcoming smile on his face, holding an open door, a symbol of the inclusivity and warmth that defined his legacy. As the crowd gathered around the statue, Marcus stepped forward to speak. His voice carried a mix of reverence and gratitude as he addressed the audience. "Mr. Thomas didn't set out to change the world," Marcus said. "He simply chose to live by principles that reflected the best of humanity. But in doing so, he showed us all that one person, leading with kindness, can create a ripple effect that transforms countless lives." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the streets. As the celebration continued into the night, the legacy of Mr. Thomas shone brighter than ever, a testament to the enduring power of respect, kindness, and humility.